close your eyes. Imagine the clatter of steel wheels on distant tracks, the long whistle of a locomotive stretching into the night air, and the figure of a lone traveler, stepping quietly into the shadows. Tonight, we follow the forgotten stories of hobos, men and women of the early 20th century who carried little but courage, wandering from town to town, chasing work, freedom, or sometimes only the rhythm of the rails. But the nights were long, the winters harsh, and survival meant creativity, resilience, and an odd sort of fellowship. Let us drift into their world, slowly and softly, and see how they endured the bitter cold beneath the stars. The endless winter of the rails. The rails stretched on forever. Cold steel lines, vanishing into horizons dusted white, threading their way across plains, mountains, and forgotten stretches of America. For the hobo of the early 20th century, these rails were both lifeline and punishment. They carried you forward, yes, toward the next town, the next chance of work, the next meal, but in winter, they also carried you deeper into the embrace of bitter cold. Nights could be long, stretching endlessly, with winds that sliced like knives and stars that looked too sharp to belong to a gentle sky. And always there was the iron of the tracks, radiating back the day's chill, as though the world itself had frozen solid. Imagine yourself on such a night. You have little more than the clothes on your back, perhaps a threadbare coat scavenged from a second-hand bin, perhaps shoes whose soles already gape open at the toes. You feel the ache of hunger in your stomach, but it is the cold that presses hardest, pressing into your bones, whispering that you will not last until morning. There is no soft bed, no quilt waiting to be drawn over your shoulders. Instead, there is only the rattle of distant freight cars, and the hope that one of them might carry you away, if you can muster the strength to climb aboard. The cold was not a passing inconvenience for the rail rider. It was a constant companion, shaping the very rhythm of travel. Hobos timed their movements with the seasons. Some spoke of heading south when the air began to bite, like migrating birds. Yet work was not always waiting in warmer places, and many found themselves pinned beneath northern skies, faced with the grim challenge of simply surviving the night. The tracks did not pause for winter, and neither could those who depended on them. There was a saying among the men of the road: "The winter don't care what you carry in your pockets." Money might buy you a meal, or a few minutes of warmth in a cafe if the proprietor was kind, but once the doors shut and the lights dimmed, the cold would find you all the same. Wealth, in a hobo's world, was measured instead in scraps of cardboard, in the knowledge of where to find shelter, in the generosity of strangers, or the companionship of fellow travelers. A single ember, a shared blanket, or simply the body heat of another soul, these were treasures greater than coins when the frost came creeping. The nights had a sound to them. Not just the howl of wind between telegraph wires, though that was ever present, nor only the groan of steel as trains shifted and braked in the dark. It was a deeper quiet, punctuated by sudden bursts of movement, a coyote cry on the prairie, the snap of a branch as someone sought kindling, the shuffle of tired feet. The silence of winter along the rails was not restful, but it was absolute, settling into your chest until even your breath seemed loud against the snow. In that stillness, one understood how small a human being truly was. And yet men endured. They endured because the alternative was to stop, to lay down, and to be claimed by the cold. Hobos learned the art of patience, of curling their bodies into shapes that trapped even a little heat. They learned to choose a hollow beneath a bridge instead of the open sky, to crouch in the lee of a coal car rather than face the wind directly. Every decision was survival, and every survival became another story to share by the fire when morning finally came. In memory, those nights became softened, their sharpest edges dulled by time. Old-timers spoke of them with a mixture of pride and wistful sorrow, of the night they kept moving until dawn, of the storm that nearly buried the camp, of the stranger who offered a place beside his fire without asking a name. There was romance in the memory, but never in the moment itself. In the moment, there was only the cold, endless and uncaring, pressing against skin and spirit alike. Picture a hobo's breath, white and steady in the dark. Picture his boots, cracked and stiff, crunching on frost-hardened earth. Picture the dim outline of a freight train slowing as it nears a siding, and a sudden leap of hope that maybe, just maybe, this is the train he can catch to carry him away from this frozen night. And yet, even inside the rattling wooden walls of a boxcar, the cold does not vanish. It merely changes shape, seeping through gaps in the boards, curling in from beneath the floor. One learns quickly that there is no escaping winter along the rails. There is only enduring it. The railroads themselves seemed alive in the winter, the great engines breathing plumes of steam that condensed and drifted like ghosts across the snow. To the hobo walking alongside, those clouds looked like promises, warmth, motion, the possibility of escape. But when the train moved on, silence and frost returned, heavier than before. That was the lesson of the endless winter of the rails. Everything moved, but the cold remained. And in that stillness, in that weight of frost and iron, the hobo pressed on. He pressed on because he had to, because behind him there was nothing but hunger, and ahead there might be work, or kindness, or at the very least another day alive. And always, in the background, the wind kept whispering against the wires, a thin song above the endless steel tracks, carrying its lullaby of cold into the deep American night. And so, the first truth of hobo life in winter was this: the cold was not an enemy to be beaten, but a companion to be endured. It was always there, pressing against skin, slowing steps, numbing fingers, but it never fully claimed those who refused to stop moving. As long as a hobo walked, as long as a hobo climbed into a car or crouched beside a fire, the endless winter of the rails was survivable, one long breath at a time. And in the distance, always, a train kept rolling, its whistle rising like a reminder that somewhere ahead, warmth might yet be found. Cardboard, ash, and newspaper tricks. When the cold pressed in hardest, the hobo did not think first of blankets or thick coats. Such luxuries were rare. Instead, he thought of scraps, of the overlooked cast-offs of towns and cities, of whatever the world had left behind that could be coaxed into warmth. A man of the road learned quickly that survival was not about comfort but about cleverness, about seeing insulation where others saw only trash. Cardboard, for instance, was a treasure. Not the kind of treasure you carried proudly, but the kind you folded quietly beneath your body before sleep. Cardboard softened the ache of frozen ground, creating a fragile barrier that held in just enough heat to keep the bones from freezing solid. Some hobos called it their per man's mattress. When damp, it turned nearly useless, but when dry, even a single flattened box could mean the difference between shivering restlessly and drifting into a few hours of fragile sleep. Many spoke of raiding alleys behind stores, scavenging the refuse that shopkeepers tossed away at day's end, their hands numb but their eyes trained for the dull brown glint of corrugated salvation. Then there was newspaper, what hobos half-jokingly called hobo silk. Pages crumpled and stuffed beneath thin shirts, wrapped around shins, or layered under coats, made the air pause just long enough between body and wind to offer warmth. Each layer of newsprint trapped a little air, and air, for the desperate, became armor against frost. It mattered little what the headlines said. Yesterday's wars, scandals, and stock numbers all turned to insulation in the folds of a weary traveler's clothes. A man wrapped in enough newspaper could rustle like autumn leaves when he walked, but he might also see the morning sun rise over the tracks. Ash was yet another secret. Fires burned hot for a while, but even when the flames died, the coals left behind a quiet warmth. Hobos discovered that a bed of cooled ash, still faintly warm beneath the surface, offered shelter when laid upon. Too hot, and it burned. Too cold, and it was nothing but dust. But in that fleeting middle ground, it was a pillow of Earth's own heat. Some carried the trick further, sprinkling ash into boots to dry them, or packing warm ash into a cloth to press against chilled fingers. It was never luxurious, but in the deep cold of a railside night, even a hint of warmth felt like a gift. Of course, none of these methods lasted long. Cardboard grew damp with frost, newspaper tore with use, and ash cooled faster than one hoped. Yet these fragile, makeshift tricks became rituals, small acts of resistance against a winter that seemed determined to claim every traveler it touched. One man might layer cardboard, newspaper, and ash all together, fashioning a nest of discarded things, and find that within its fragile walls, he could pretend for a few hours that he was not entirely exposed to the vast, uncaring sky. Stories spread among the hobos about which tricks worked best, often passed around firesides like recipes. Fold your cardboard twice, so the ground doesn't steal your heat, one would say. Crumple the newspaper first, don't just lay it flat, another advised. That way it traps more air. Some men swore by stuffing their shoes with paper, while others claimed the ash trick was worth the risk of sooty clothes. These were not just tips, they were survival, a kind of folklore born from necessity, repeated in whispers, shared in camps, tested again and again in the unforgiving laboratory of winter nights. There was a kind of poetry in the resourcefulness, though few would have called it that at the time. What others threw away, the hobo transformed into shield and shelter. A grocery store's empty box, a newspaper discarded on a cafe table, the ashes of a stranger's fire, these became the tools of endurance. In a world that seemed determined to remind him of his insignificance, the hobo answered with invention, with the stubborn insistence that life could still be coaxed from scraps. And sometimes there was even humor. Hobos joked that reading the news on your chest at least gave you a chance to absorb it by osmosis. They laughed about how rustling papers scared away mice, or made them sound like walking scarecrows. Laughter, too, was insulation, a small flame that burned inside and kept spirits alive. But humor did not erase the truth, even the best tricks were fragile, temporary. On the coldest nights, cardboard turned brittle, newspaper stiffened with frost, and ash grew icy under thin hands. The tricks delayed the cold, but they did not banish it. And so, the hobo learned another lesson, that survival was never in one trick alone, but in the layering of many, and in the willingness to try again, night after night, with whatever scraps the world allowed. Picture a man curling into a hollow beside the tracks, his body pressed against cardboard, his coat lined with crumpled headlines, his boots filled with yesterday's words. The fire beside him has burned to embers, leaving only a faint glow beneath the ash. He lowers himself carefully onto the still warm bed, the heat seeping just enough into his bones to quiet the shaking. Above him, stars burn cold, uncaring, and the whistle of a distant train cuts through the night. Yet for now, he has carved out a pocket of survival, a fragile shelter from the endless frost. It was not comfort. It was not security. But it was enough. Enough to drift for a while into uneasy sleep, enough to rise again at dawn and continue walking, enough to see another town, another chance, another fire. And in the background, the newspaper rustled softly, a lullaby of thin pages carrying him through the night. The brotherhood of the fire. If cardboard, newspaper, and ash were the solitary tricks of survival, then fire was the communal one. It was the heart of every hobo jungle, the glowing center where men gathered, not only to keep warm but also to remember, however briefly, what it felt like to belong. The winter along the rails was merciless, but the fire softened its grip, and more than that, it made the nights bearable through companionship. A hobo jungle was rarely much to look at in daylight. It might be nothing more than a clearing beside the tracks, a hollow under a bridge, or a scrap of woods outside a town. Scattered cans, a few makeshift shelters, bits of cloth tied to branches, all spoke of men who passed through, stayed a night or two, and moved on. But when dusk came and flames were coaxed from twigs and coal, that unremarkable ground became something else, a place of warmth, a fragile village born from necessity. Around the fire, strangers became companions. Some men carried harmonicas, their tunes weaving through the smoke. Others told stories, voices rising and falling in rhythm with the crackling flames. Stories of jobs lost, of freight trains caught and missed, of winters harsher than this one, of towns where the sheriff turned a blind eye or where the cafe owner slid a plate across the counter with no questions asked. The stories were never polished. They were fragments, offered in low voices, sometimes cut short by silence. Yet in the sharing, the men became less alone. There was a ritual to it. Someone would gather wood, driftwood from a riverbank, branches from a thicket, even splintered bits of discarded crates. Another would strike the match, shielding it with calloused hands against the wind. And then, as the flames grew, men would step closer, forming a loose circle, careful not to crowd, careful to leave room for each traveler to come and go. No one asked names immediately. Names could wait. First came the warmth, the chance to feel one's fingers again, the gift of silence broken only by the popping of sap in the logs. And yet, the fire was never free. Each man who took from it was expected to give something back. If not wood, then perhaps food, or knowledge of the rails, or simply a story. In this unspoken economy, contribution was as vital as survival. A man who only took soon found himself unwelcome. A man who shared, however little, was accepted. The fire did more than warm the body. It also burned away some of the mistrust that followed hobos in every town. Here, among their own, they could set down their guard, if only slightly. The same men who in daylight kept watchful eyes, quick to scatter at the sound of boots or whistles, now leaned back, their faces softened by orange light. For a while, the world outside, the lawmen, the hunger, the endless rails, seemed far away. What remained was the circle, the flame, and the quiet company of those who understood. Food often appeared at these fires, shared in small, uneven meals. A can of beans, opened with a pocket knife and balanced on the edge of the flames. Bread, torn in rough halves or quarters. Sometimes, if fortune was kind, there was meat, thin slices sizzling on wire scavenged for a makeshift grill. The smell of cooking, simple as it was, filled the camp with a comfort stronger than the food itself. To eat beside others, to feel the warmth of fire and fellowship at once, was to remember that survival did not have to mean solitude. There were codes, too, etched into the culture of the road. Some camps marked safe places with chalk or carved symbols, so that a hobo arriving cold and desperate would know where to find the fire. Others passed along warnings, of towns unfriendly, of sheriffs quick with a baton, of trains too heavily guarded to risk. The jungle fire became more than warmth, it became a node in a vast, invisible network, a chain of memory and message that stretched across the country. Yet even in fellowship, danger lingered. Fires drew eyes, and not always kind ones. A sheriff might descend with deputies, scattering the camp, stomping out the embers. Townsfolk sometimes complained, fearing theft or simply resenting the sight of desperate men gathered on the edge of their fields. And so the brotherhood of the fire lived in a state of fragile impermanence. The flames rose, the stories were told, and then, as dawn neared or trouble threatened, the men scattered once again, leaving only a ring of ash and the faint smell of smoke. Still, for those who knew it, the fire lingered long after. Old hobos, remembering winters past, often spoke not of the cold itself but of the warmth found in jungles. They remembered the faces lit by firelight, the laughter that pushed back the frost, the music of a harmonica that carried them, if only for a moment, far from the rails. They remembered the way silence seemed different when shared, less sharp, less cruel. In the brotherhood of the fire, survival became something more than endurance. It became community. Picture it now, a ring of tired men, coats patched and boots worn, sitting close to a fire at the edge of the tracks. The flames dance, throwing light against the underside of a bridge, catching the silver of rails that stretch into the dark. Someone hums softly, another pokes at the embers, another leans back with eyes closed, letting the warmth soak in. Beyond the circle, the night remains vast and cold, but here, within this fragile glow, there is comfort. And as the night deepens, as the fire burns lower, some drift into sleep, their heads bowed against their arms, their dreams mingling with the rhythm of the crackling wood. Others sit watch, keeping the flame alive, ensuring the circle remains unbroken. The fire becomes both guardian and companion, a small miracle against the endless cold. In the end, the brotherhood of the fire was less about the flame itself and more about the bond it created. A bond of survival, yes, but also of humanity, the reminder that even in the harshest winters, no man truly endured alone. The glow of the fire, the murmur of voices, the quiet laughter carried into the dark, all became part of the great, unrecorded history of the rails. And in the background, always, the fire kept crackling, its warmth a steady pulse in the cold American night. Sleeping in boxcars. For every hobo, the sight of a boxcar slowing into a siding stirred a mixture of hope and hesitation. Hope, because within those tall wooden walls there was shelter, however thin, from the bite of the wind. Hesitation, because every boxcar carried its own dangers, railroad detectives, sudden jolts, and the ever-present threat of being thrown out, or worse. Yet when the night pressed cold and the ground turned unkind, the boxcar remained one of the hobo's most trusted refuges. At first glance, a boxcar seems an unlikely bedroom. Its floors were rough planks, often littered with sawdust, grain, or coal dust left from its last load. Drafts cut through the cracks in the wood, and iron wheels carried the cold of the earth directly upward into the boards. Still, to the man who had been sleeping under bridges or crouching beside meager fires, it was shelter enough. The walls blocked the wind, and that small reprieve could mean survival on the iciest nights. Climbing aboard was its own ritual. A practiced hobo waited for the train to slow, his eyes scanning for an open door or a gap he might squeeze through. Timing mattered. Jump too soon, and you risked a stumble. Wait too long, and the train gathered speed, leaving you behind in the cold. Many men spoke of the heart's quick beat in that moment, the leap, the hands grasping for iron, the pull of muscles straining to lift you into safety. For those who succeeded, the reward was a hollow space, dim and echoing, but out of the wind. Inside, the car was never silent. The groan of wood, the steady clank of couplers, the hiss and rattle of wheels against rail, all became the soundtrack of a night's rest. To the uninitiated, these sounds might seem restless, but to the hobo, they became a kind of lullaby. Each rattle told him the train still moved, each groan meant the car still carried him forward, each whistle in the distance sang of towns yet unseen. Sleep came not in spite of the noise, but because of it. Hobos learned quickly how to make the boxcar livable, even if only for a few hours. A pile of straw from an earlier cargo might be gathered into a nest. A coat spread across wooden planks offered a little comfort. Cardboard, once again, proved its worth, slipped beneath the body to soften the bite of the boards. Some men carried burlap sacks, light and foldable, which they could spread beneath them or pull around their shoulders as makeshift blankets. In the thin light of lanterns or the moon slipping through the slats, these small arrangements transformed the boxcar into something resembling a room, sparse, drafty, but shelter nonetheless. There was often company inside. Rarely did a hobo find a boxcar to himself for long. Another traveler might already be curled in the shadows, or might leap aboard moments later, breathless from the chase. Etiquette dictated caution, voices low, movements slow. At first, two strangers might regard each other with suspicion, eyes measuring whether the other posed a threat. But soon, necessity softened the edges. A nod, a muttered greeting, the sharing of a cigarette or flask, all these gestures forged a fragile peace. Within a short time, two men became companions, bound not by friendship but by the shared knowledge of survival. Yet the dangers remained. Railroad detectives, known as bulls, patrolled the yards, keen to keep trespassers away. A sudden beam of light, the bark of a voice, could mean a hasty leap into the dark, stumbling into snow or gravel. Some men were beaten, others hauled off to spend the night in a cold jail cell. And there were other risks. The sudden lurch of the train that threw a man from the car, or the careless moment when fingers slipped from the iron and the wheels claimed what the cold had not. For every hobo who spoke fondly of the shelter of a boxcar, another carried scars from its dangers. Still, for many, the memory of sleeping in a boxcar held a strange comfort. They spoke of the way the planks vibrated beneath them, carrying the rhythm of the rails directly into their bones. They spoke of drifting into half-sleep, the mind balanced between dream and wakefulness, rocked by the motion of the train. They spoke of waking at dawn to see light spill through the slats, painting the walls with thin golden lines, and realizing they had survived another night. Sometimes, a group of hobos filled a car together, transforming it into a temporary dormitory. Men lined along the walls, knees drawn to chests, heads bowed against arms. In the dark, whispers traveled, exchanging news of jobs in the next town, recounting warnings of unfriendly sheriffs, trading small scraps of wisdom. In those moments, the boxcar became more than shelter. It became a moving community, rolling through the night, its walls holding both the weary and their stories. Imagine it. The boxcar sways gently, each creak a rhythm, each jolt a reminder of motion. A man curls in one corner, newspaper lining his shirt. Another hums softly, a tune barely audible above the wheels. A third pulls his hat low, drifting into sleep. The air smells of wood and dust, of smoke clinging to coats, of faint sweat and coal. Outside, the night is sharp and merciless, but here, within these rattling walls, there is the illusion of safety. The cold seeps in still, but it is softened by wood and companionship, by the knowledge that the rails carry you ever onward. For the hobo, sleeping in a boxcar was never luxury, never true comfort. It was a pause, a fragile reprieve. But often that was enough. Enough to make the long night survivable, enough to keep moving when morning came, enough to remind a man that even in a life of wandering, there were still small shelters waiting to be claimed. And as the train rumbled deeper into the night, the boxcar rocked gently, like a cradle built of steel and wood, carrying its weary passengers through the endless cold. And in the background, the wheels kept singing their steady, rattling lullaby, a rhythm that carried hobos into uneasy but enduring sleep. Cold meals and hot spirits. For the men who wandered the rails in winter, food was not just a necessity. It was warmth, comfort, and when shared, a form of companionship. The hobo's relationship with his meals was far from glamorous. It was often sparse, improvised, and meager. But when the night pressed down with a sharp cold and the snow crackled underfoot, a scrap of food and a sip of something hot could feel like a feast fit for kings. Most days, a hobo's meal came from what he could scavenge, beg, or barter. Many carried with them the classic bindle, a sack tied to the end of a stick, or perhaps just a few pockets lined with crumbs of bread and a can or two of beans. Beans became almost a symbol of the road, cheap, easy to carry, and forgiving to cook. A can of beans heated over an open fire in a tin pot was a kind of ritual. The sound of bubbling beans, the smell drifting into the cold air, offered comfort beyond the calories. In the dark silence near the rails, a simple can of beans could feel like luxury. Sometimes there was no chance to build a fire, no way to warm food at all. Many a hobo learned to eat meals cold, beans straight from the can, or bread pulled hard and stale from a pocket. Some grew used to sardines or pickled items, cheap goods that did not spoil quickly. These cold meals were not pleasant, but they filled the stomach, which was sometimes all that could be asked. Imagine a man crouched against a frosted wall, his breath hanging in the night, the tin lid peeled back, his fingers stiff with cold as he lifted food straight to his lips. No seasoning, no elegance, only survival. And yet, in those quiet moments, when hunger met relief, even cold beans could carry a kind of sweetness. Of course, warmth could sometimes be found not only in food but in drink. The hot spirits of the rails often referred less to tea or coffee and more to something stronger. A flask passed around the fire could spread warmth, if only briefly. Whiskey, moonshine, or whatever cheap liquor could be acquired was used to keep spirits high and to trick the body into thinking it was warm. Hobos knew, deep down, that alcohol did not truly save you from the cold. In fact, it sometimes made the danger greater. But in the moment, when the frost bit hard, a swig from the bottle felt like fire in the veins. It carried courage and camaraderie, and often that was enough. Still, not every drink was strong. Some hobos carried with them tea leaves or coffee grounds, gifts from kind hands or small purchases from towns. To sit by a fire, waiting for water to boil in a battered tin can, was an act of patience and reward. The smell of coffee, thin, watery though it might have been, was a promise of warmth. Hobos learned tricks, adding a pinch of sugar if they had it, or stretching one spoonful across several days by reusing grounds. A shared cup of coffee could bind men together, drawing them into a quiet circle of comfort amid the cold. Even without milk, without cream, without the luxuries of a cafe, that dark liquid spoke of warmth and survival. Food was also a social glue. Around a fire in a hobo jungle, men pooled what little they had. One brought beans, another bread, another a scrap of meat scavenged from a butcher's refuse. A stew might be made in a communal pot, each man contributing what he could. The result was humble, thin, often unseasoned, but it was food shared, and that made it richer. These meals, simple as they were, became the settings of stories and laughter, where hunger was softened by companionship. A spoonful of stew tasted better when eaten beside a friend, and the smoke of the fire rose like a kind of blessing into the night sky. In the hardest winters, however, food was scarce. There were nights when men went to sleep on empty stomachs, bellies aching, heads heavy with exhaustion. In those moments, warmth was sought in imagination. Hobos dreamed of pies cooling on windowsills, of roasts set upon Sunday tables, of biscuits and gravy served in diners they passed but could not afford. Hunger and cold walked hand in hand, and sometimes the thought of a meal, as much as the meal itself, sustained a man through the night. Children of the Depression remembered these men, quiet figures who knocked on doors, who offered to chop wood, mend fences, or sweep barns in exchange for a plate of food. Many households turned them away, but some showed kindness. A warm biscuit, a bowl of soup, a slice of pie offered to a stranger carried weight beyond measure. For the hobo, it was not only nourishment but a reminder of human compassion, a warmth of spirit that burned brighter than any fire. Thus, food on the rails was more than sustenance. It was a thread that tied together survival, companionship, and the fragile warmth of humanity. Cold meals eaten alone carried the bite of solitude, while hot spirits passed around the fire brought laughter and loosened the edge of despair. Even in the harshest nights, the act of eating, whether beans from a can or stew from a communal pot, was a moment of resistance against the cold, a small but vital declaration of life. And so, as the trains rumbled on through frozen valleys and snow-covered plains, the hobos found comfort in the simplest of meals. A tin can hissing over the fire. A sip of strong liquor warming the throat. The clink of spoons in a shared pot. Around them, the frost stretched on endlessly, yet in those moments, there was warmth enough to carry on. And in the stillness of the night, with the fire crackling low and the taste of beans lingering faintly on the tongue, the cold seemed, if only for a while, a little less cruel. The harsh cost of cold. The cold, for the hobo, was more than a nuisance. It was a hunter, a silent predator that followed along the rails, waiting for a moment of weakness. Frost and wind were patient. They did not need to rush. They only needed the body to falter, to slow down, to stop moving. And once stillness set in, the cold did its work. Every winter on the rails brought stories of men who did not make it through the night. Frostbite was a constant companion, the first warning that winter's hand had tightened its grip. Fingers and toes, ears and noses, they were the small outposts of the body, the farthest reaches from the core. They were the first to surrender to ice. A man might wake to find his fingertips numb, his boots frozen stiff, the skin of his feet pale and waxy. Pain came next, a burning sting that eventually dulled into silence. Some wrapped their feet in rags, layering scrap upon scrap of cloth, hoping to trap even the faintest whisper of warmth. Others relied on newspaper, which served as insulation as well as bedding. But when temperatures dropped too low, no trick was always enough. Frostbite gnawed, slow and merciless. Illness followed close behind. Coughs rattled through hobo camps, spreading like smoke from one man to the next. Pneumonia was feared as much as hunger. A chill caught while riding an open car, a night spent sleeping on damp ground, a chest left exposed to icy air, all of these could lead to fever and lung infection. Without doctors, without medicine, most men simply endured. They huddled close to fires, they wrapped themselves in every scrap they could find, they prayed for the fever to break. Sometimes it did. Other times, it carried men away quietly, leaving their companions to whisper a few words, cover the body, and move on down the tracks. The cost of cold was not always measured in death, but in loss. Many men carried scars of frostbite, fingers that no longer bent properly, feet that ached with every step. To be crippled on the road was a terrible fate. A man who could not walk could not ride, and a man who could not ride could not roam. He became stranded, cut off from the freedom that defined the hobo life. Some turned to begging full-time, others vanished into poorhouses or hospitals, if they could find them. The cold marked them permanently, reminding all who survived that winter was not to be taken lightly. Yet for all its danger, the cold was also woven into the identity of those who lived on the rails. To endure the winter was to prove one's resilience. Hobos told stories of nights spent clinging to warmth, of waking with ice crusting their beards, of snow piled high against the boxcar door. These tales were shared not as boasts, but as lessons. They taught younger men the seriousness of winter, the importance of preparation, the need to never underestimate frost. Survival was earned, not granted. Death, when it came, was usually quiet. Unlike the dramatic crashes of trains or the violence of railway bulls, the cold took slowly. A man might be seen one evening, wrapped in his coat, leaning against a fire, nodding in drowsy silence. By morning he might be gone, his body stilled under a thin blanket of snow. Others found their end in empty cars, huddled into corners, frozen stiff before dawn. Companions learned not to shake the sleeping too roughly, for sometimes sleep and death looked the same in winter. Despite the sadness, there was also a strange poetry to these quiet endings. Hobos lived close to the elements, and many seemed to accept the risks of their chosen life. The cold was part of the deal, the other side of the freedom they cherished. They knew the price, and still they chose the road, the rails, the endless horizon. For some, there was no regret, only the wish to be remembered, even faintly, by those who kept moving forward. Communities of hobos developed their own rituals for handling the loss. A man who passed in a jungle camp might be buried nearby, the grave marked with a simple wooden cross or a pile of stones. Others received no marker at all, their resting place hidden along the tracks, known only to the few who were there. But the stories of the dead lived on. Names were passed from one campfire to another, from one group of travelers to the next. In this way, memory warmed them, like an ember that refused to die out completely. The harsh cost of cold was not only physical but emotional. Companionship mattered deeply in winter. A man traveling alone was far more likely to succumb. Those who had a partner, or a group, could share warmth, share food, share vigilance. To lose a companion to the cold was to feel the world grow sharper, lonelier. It was a reminder that the rail life, for all its camaraderie, carried deep solitude at its heart. Still, even against the unforgiving winter, men carried on. They wrapped themselves tighter, they huddled closer to fires, they endured. They bore the scars, the coughs, the frostbitten fingers, and they walked forward, step after step, to the next town, the next camp, the next chance at warmth. In every survivor was the quiet triumph of endurance. The cold demanded its cost, but it never claimed them all. And so, winter lingered as both enemy and teacher. Its lessons were hard, its price steep, but those who survived emerged stronger, carrying the knowledge in their bones. Knowledge that warmth, when found, was a blessing never to be taken for granted. Knowledge that even the smallest flame could stand against the vastness of ice. And in the distance, as the wind howled across the plains and the snow fell soft upon the rails, the trains kept moving, their steel wheels ringing against the frozen track. The cold took many, but the road always called the rest onward. And in the hush of night, with the fire guttering low and breath rising like mist into the sky, the hobos sat in silence, aware of the cost, and quietly grateful to have survived one more night. Romance of the cold rails. For all the hardship, for all the frostbitten fingers and sleepless nights, there was something about winter on the rails that left behind a strange kind of romance. Not the romance of luxury, nor of comfort, but of raw beauty, of men brushing shoulders with the vastness of the land, of survival etched against skies of silver and blue. To the hobos who endured it, memory softened the cold, turned hardship into story, and painted frost not only as an enemy but as a quiet companion. The rails in winter had their own music. The train wheels, biting into frozen tracks, sang a sharper note than in summer. Steel echoed against steel, ringing into valleys where snow muffled all other sound. The whistle cut through the night like a lonely cry, drifting over fields glazed with frost. For those who rode in open cars, bundled in rags, the air stung the face but carried a beauty of its own. Stars blazed colder, clearer, in the crisp night sky, and the moon cast a pale light that turned even broken landscapes into something dreamlike. The hobos remembered these sights. In later years, when they spoke of their travels, they sometimes smiled when recalling a snowlit horizon, as if the very harshness of it had made the moment pure. Fires burned brighter in winter. Not only in warmth but in spirit. Around a circle of men, sparks leapt upward, glowing against the black dome of the sky. Breath mingled with smoke. Shadows swayed against snowbanks, making the fire seem larger than it was. In those moments, even thin stew and stale bread became a kind of feast. The camaraderie of winter fires, the stories traded, the songs hummed, the silence shared, made the cold into something communal, almost sacred. Later, when a man thought back on his years of wandering, he often remembered not only the cold itself, but the fellowship it created. There was romance, too, in the landscapes themselves. Winter transformed the countryside into endless sheets of white. Forests groaned under the weight of snow, rivers froze into glass, and empty fields glittered under the morning frost. For hobos who came from the smoke and grit of city streets, these sights were almost unbelievable. Even while shivering, they could look out and feel something like wonder. A journey through winter was a journey through silence, through a world stripped bare, through nature at its most unforgiving and its most beautiful. Some men wrote about these moments in journals, their handwriting crooked in the margins of scavenged notebooks. Others carried them only in memory, letting the images settle deep in their bones. The romance was not in the suffering itself, but in the awareness of having lived through something so vast, so elemental. To ride through winter was to feel, if only briefly, like part of the earth's oldest rhythm. The cold made every breath sharper, every flame brighter, every small comfort more meaningful. And of course, romance can also mean tenderness, those fleeting, human moments that warmed the road. Hobos sometimes spoke of friendships that blossomed stronger in winter, when dependence grew heavier. A hand offered to share a blanket. A stranger's portion of food pressed into another's palm. Even laughter, rising like smoke above the snow, felt like a gift. In the cold, gestures mattered more. They lingered longer. And long after the journey ended, those moments were remembered not for their grandeur but for their quiet kindness. For some, the memory of winter on the rails even carried a kind of nostalgia. Hardship, once survived, takes on a different shape in the mind. Men who had cursed the cold, who had groaned through nights of aching feet and trembling hands, would later recall the same nights with a softness in their voice. They would speak of the white silence, the glitter of frost on train rails, the shared flasks of whiskey under a sky of stars. They would speak of the firelight, flickering on faces now long gone, and how even the cruelest nights held a beauty they had not forgotten. This was the romance of the cold rails. It was not sweet. It was not tender in the way of warm hearths and family tables. But it was real, and for many it became part of the story they told themselves about who they were. Men who had endured could look back and know they had stood face to face with the season that claimed so many. They had been marked by frost, but they had not been erased. That survival itself became a quiet badge, a kind of love affair with the stubbornness of the human spirit. The poetry of it is easier to see from a distance. In the moment, men shivered and ached, groaned and prayed. But later, in memory, even those struggles became threads in a larger tapestry. Winter on the rails was woven with both darkness and light, with hunger and frost, yes, but also with beauty and companionship. In the hush of snow falling through lamplight, in the rhythm of trains crossing icy rivers, in the quiet strength of men leaning close to a small fire, romance lingered. It lingered in the stories, in the songs, in the way men's eyes softened when they spoke of those long, cold nights. And so, the hobos, for all their hardship, carried with them not only scars of the cold but also its strange grace. They remembered the silence of snowy nights, the glow of fires in the dark, the way the stars seemed nearer when the air was sharp with frost. To live through the winter was to walk in step with both suffering and wonder, and to emerge with a story that could only be told by those who had truly felt it. And somewhere in the distance, the rails kept gleaming in the moonlight, stretching endlessly ahead, carrying both the weight of hardship and the soft shimmer of romance. And as the fire burned low and the night pressed in, the hobos leaned back, watching sparks rise into the dark, their hearts caught between ache and awe, knowing that even the cold had its beauty. Closing/sleep transition. Now, as the rails stretch into the distance, and the wind whispers through the snow-covered trees, we pause to let the world of the hobo fade softly behind us. The firelight dims. The distant whistle of a train becomes a gentle sigh in the night. We leave behind the frozen ground, the cardboard beds, the trembling hands and frostbitten toes, and drift quietly toward calm, toward the hush that follows hardship. Think of the men who traveled these rails long ago. They had no warm houses to return to, no blankets piled high on feather beds. They had only the tracks, the stars, the occasional fire, and the cleverness that turned scraps into life. And yet, in their perseverance, there was a rhythm to existence, a pulse of survival that carried them forward, step by step, mile by mile. Each movement through winter, each shiver endured, each frozen breath drawn into the icy air became part of a quiet, enduring story. Close your eyes, if you like, and imagine it. Picture a night so deep and silent that even your own heartbeat feels loud. The rails stretch endlessly into shadow. Fires flicker in small camps. Men huddle beside one another, wrapped in coats, newspapers, and cardboard, trading whispers and quiet laughter. Perhaps someone hums a tune, low and soft, and you can hear it carrying across the snow. The air is sharp but clear, and even as frost collects on eyelashes and boots stiffen with cold, there is a sense of presence, a sense of being alive, held by something larger than oneself. The cold, of course, is still there. It presses against the skin, tugs at the edges of warmth, reminds the body of its limits. But here, in memory, it does not bite as sharply. It is softened by the rhythm of fire, by companionship, by the knowledge that survival is more than enduring, it is witnessing, and learning, and remembering. You may feel a shiver, a gentle echo of the past, but it fades, dissolving into the calm of this moment, as you listen, as you breathe, as you drift. Hobos on the rails discovered that the smallest comforts mattered most. The warmth of a shared fire. The whisper of a friend beside you. The taste of beans, simple yet sustaining. The sway of a boxcar in motion, rocking the body into sleep. Each small act of ingenuity, each gesture of kindness, each spark against the cold contributed to the quiet wonder of life on the edge of the tracks. And though hardship was constant, these small comforts became enough. They became rhythm. They became story. And so, as we leave this world of frost and fire, let the story settle like a gentle snowfall. Let your mind drift through cardboard beds, through emberlit circles of fire, through nights spent huddled in boxcars. Let the echoes of distant whistles carry you farther away from worry, farther away from the weight of cold and hunger. In the hush, the rails stretch endlessly into dream. You might imagine yourself lying beside the fire, warmth creeping slowly into chilled fingers. Perhaps you are leaning against a friend's shoulder, sharing silence and comfort without words. The stars stretch overhead, glimmering faintly through gaps in the trees, and the night is still, and wide, and infinite. Each breath draws in the chill and releases it softly, each heartbeat slows, settling into the rhythm of the story, the rhythm of endurance, the rhythm of rest. The roads of frost and fire, the rails traveled in patience and courage, now rest behind you like pages of a book closing gently. Every scrap of newspaper, every flicker of flame, every quiet laugh around a winter campfire, becomes part of the memory of a world that existed once, and yet continues to live in imagination. You carry it without effort, without strain, as though it were always meant to be with you. And perhaps now, in this quiet moment, the trains themselves become lullabies. The creak of a coupler, the distant echo of wheels over frozen track, the sigh of wind across open fields, all these form a gentle, repetitive pattern that mirrors the rhythm of your own breathing. Inhale, and you remember the cold. Exhale, and you feel the warmth of fire, companionship, and the soft weight of story. Inhale, and you recall the clever tricks of survival. Exhale, and the ache of frost melts into rest. Imagine the snow settling over the rails, muffling the world. Imagine fires dying slowly, leaving only the faint warmth and the glow of embers. Imagine men curled into cardboard and blankets, their breaths mingling with smoke and frost, and imagine the quiet peace that comes from having endured another night. Let that sense of peace drift into you now, carrying away tension, carrying away thought, leaving only the soft hum of life and story. As the story of the rails closes, let your mind wander through its lingering images, the swaying boxcar, the rustle of newspaper, the gleam of frost under a silver moon. Let the whispers of the hobo jungle fade into quiet memory. Let the cold itself soften, becoming not an enemy, but a gentle companion in the narrative you now carry inside. Your body, your mind, your heart, all may settle here, into the calm, into the hush, into the gentle continuation of the story in sleep. And finally, as the embers of the fire dim completely, as the stars track silently across the sky, as the rails stretch endlessly beyond sight, allow yourself to drift fully into rest. The men of the past have already moved on. The cold of history no longer presses against you. Only warmth, memory, and gentle rhythm remain. Breathe deeply, slowly. Let the quiet settle over you. Let the rails carry you into dreams, soft and steady. Sleep now, gently, and let the story linger, like smoke rising from a fire long extinguished but never forgotten. The hobo, the fire, the rails, and the winter, they remain in imagination, timeless, quiet, and full of slow, enduring beauty.